Welcome to Savage Minds. I'm your host, Julian Vigo. Today's guest is Kaspar de Ploeg, a grassroots organizer, journalist, and author of The Exterminating Empire, The Great Colonial War, and Ukraine in the Crossfire. He is also co-founder and core organizer of Arales, a grassroots organization for decolonization and Arts of Resistance, a coalition bridging social movements and the arts. Chris was the lead candidate for the Amsterdam Revolutionary Party De Vonk, where he currently serves as a board member. He writes, speaks, and organizes on various social justice topics, including neocolonialism, climate justice, racism, and capitalism. I welcome Chris de Ploeg to Savage Minds. I'm at this point, I think it's just been so much, especially since 7 October in 23. But even before that, since lockdown, it seems like the work that we do as journalists, your work as an activist, it seems like the battles are on all fronts, because it's not only what is happening, let's say in Sudan or in Gaza or in Venezuela. That's easy. We have to battle the misinformation wars while these legacy media outlets somehow don't realize that they're on the downside of losing all of their spectatorship, their readership, because people no longer believe them.
Yeah.
Phenomenally, Iran, its ministers, its leaders have been able to cue in to what people are saying and feeling. And I never thought I'd live to see the day that obviously the global south was always going to be on Iran's side, because they're living that in very different and more torturous ways to some degree. Famine, manipulation of their economies, IMF, World Bank, and so forth. But I never thought I'd see the day that so many Americans were on the Iranian team rooting for what seems to be, it's not just we're on, we don't want mullahs to rule the world necessarily. I'm talking for the neoliberal here, but a lot of people understand that they don't know what to make of things, because they're understanding one thing: they've been lied to. And they've been lied to for many years. And I think, like in your media analysis, particularly concerning international conflicts, you frequently challenge legacy media frameworks. We're seeing this free fall of legacy media losing people. I think the latest stats I read is that CNN and Fox News are getting far less viewership than people like Tucker Carlson or Joe Rogan or Megyn Kelly or Candace Owens. Like them or hate them, we can see that something has happened to legacy media, and their attempt to shore up their damage of loss of patrons, let's say, by hiring Barry Weiss has been schadenfreude of the nth degree, because she's made the situation not only worse, but we're watching it. It's like a car crash. It's wonderful. So what are the primary mechanisms within Western mainstream media that are used to fabricate or maintain imperialist and xenophobic narratives regarding any of the events that we've witnessed in recent years or months?
Wow, that's a big question, and there are so many to name. I think it is obvious that that a lot of perspectives are just censored out of the media. I can give you a very concrete personal example. In fact, my first book I wrote was about the war in Ukraine. And I'm talking about 2016. So I was writing about it when most people weren't. I published a book. And at the time in the Netherlands, there was actually an entire referendum going on about the EU association agreement with Ukraine. So it was on the news every single day. And I wrote a book which was, critical of Russia, but also showing, that the West also had a lot of a big role to play in everything that happened. The title was Ukraine in the Crossfire. Actually, I wrote it originally in English, but it was speed translated to Dutch for the referendum, so it came out early in Dutch. But because of that, I had a Ukrainian editor, Volodymyr Ishenko, who was, was quite well known. I had like endorsements from quite prominent academics like Stephen Cohen and Richard Sakwa. So, and at the time, there were only about 3 recent books on Ukraine in the Dutch language. One of them was more like about medieval history. One of them was just so clearly propaganda that the title was literally like "Vote Yes" for the for the agreement. And I was the only book. I had like 600 endnotes. It was well documented. You would say like this should be in all the media. It has like the endorsements and everything. And it was just a complete, total, utter blackout. Like I didn't get invited to a single mainstream outlet. And it was obvious why. I just didn't fit into the frame. And it was very interesting because I was quite young at the time. I think I was like 21 years old. And I just done an internship at one of the even more like progressive, lefty news outlets, but somewhat mainstream, called the Groene Amsterdammer. And a colleague of mine there wrote a whole essay saying like all the literature that is being published around the Ukraine referendum. And it managed to not mention my book, which I found quite astounding. But it did mention a lot of like really obscure far-right pamphlets that were, saying vote no. And it was very obvious why he didn't mention my book, because it just didn't fit into the framing. It was like the reasonable, good, read and researched people all say vote yes and have a very pro-Ukraine perspective. I wouldn't even really call it pro-Ukraine, but moving Ukraine towards the West perspective. And my book just didn't fit into that frame, and then it just got completely blacked out. Well, why does that happen? That's a longer discussion to have. I think there are many different factors. Of course, the famous book written by Edward Herman with Chomsky, but actually Edward Herman was the main author that people often forget, suggested there are several filters, right? So one of them is to realize that actually the readers and the viewers are not actually the clients, they're the products. The real clients are the advertisers. And this is especially the case for like radio and TV, but it's also largely the case for newspapers and even magazines. So obviously, if you have a perspective that consistently goes against the grain of what big corporations want, even if it's slight and subtle, the resources you'll get start becoming less and less. So even a lot of these journalists who might believe what they might genuinely believe in like a very pro-Western, pro-imperialist perspective and not even consciously censor other things out, but they will just get a much bigger platform, much more resources and things like that. Obviously, there's a lot more other factors we see, especially with the genocide in Palestine, that the Israel lobby plays a huge role. Herman called this flack, the fear of being sued. There was a specific case, for example, in the Netherlands where the state broadcaster was sued by the main Israel lobby group, the CD, for even, reporting some basic facts about how little food was being led into Gaza during the genocide. So there's that. There's the whole, careerism, group dynamics. You just know. I think everybody who's in journalism kind of knows the lines you're not allowed to cross. Very clearly. They won't say it, but everybody knows. In fact, I often talk to journalists like behind the scenes who are kind of critical, but not entirely there, and who kind of wormed their way in. And, they always know. They know exactly what to say, not to say. This is, I think, very obvious and clear to everyone. And obviously, one big dynamic also that they use is a very sleazy way to do it is that they'll just report what the Ukrainian or Israeli or American or Dutch military or government spokesperson said without critical comment. But then they can say like, I didn't say it, they said it, but they report on it without, any critical analysis. And they will never do that for the opposing side. If any Russian or Palestinian or Iranian authorities are mentioned, in the case of Palestine and in Gaza, they'll always say like Hamas run ministry or Hamas run this, Hamas run that. After, of course, years of complete demonization and making sure that Hamas is not, associated with the legitimate government of Gaza, which, whatever you think of Hamas, it was democratically elected in 2006. Of course, there haven't been elections since then, but that's because Israel doesn't want there to be elections. So, people think, oh, it's just like some terrorist outlet saying these things. So there are many, many ways that they do this. Often they'll set a frame at the start very clearly. We saw this with in early phase of the genocide when, they were leveling all these hospitals. And then at the start, they'll like sow some doubts about whether it was actually Israel bombing them. And then, once the actual facts come out, it'll be much later and much, much less read. And it will be on like page 12 or something like that instead of the headlines or the cover pages. So there are many, many mechanisms, I think, through which they operate. And in large part, as I said, it's, there's part of the kind of careerism and the cowardice in the media. Honestly, also on a personal level, I remember really a kind of switch in my mind, especially with the genocide in Palestine, that, for a long time I was still kind of trying to get into these outlets, and here and there I managed, and like with some strategic things you can or cannot say, but at some point I was just like, you know what, I don't even want to beg anymore at these places to get in there. But in the broader structure, it's there's a political economy behind it, right? I mentioned like the advertising, the whole structure and way in which it is set up. Of course, even state-run outlets, they are dependent on subsidies, and the state obviously also plays a big role there. But also like the lobby groups, where do they get their money from? How do they pressure groups? You think twice if you know that you might get sued. You might need to hire lawyers. Especially if you're a smaller outlet, that is a big deal. Like all these things factor in. So there's the whole political economy perspective sitting behind it as well.
Well, I was thinking as you spoke in terms of Ukraine, if part of the problem of how these media outlets get away with doublespeak, hiding behind the Steele dossier, the way that I think just of CNN and how it's positioned Clinton for so many years as being a credible figure. Yet we know that one of the major actors in what has happened in Ukraine took place because of someone like Victoria Nuland. Now, I mention her because she's someone who's worked her little evil doings all throughout both administrations from Clinton onward. During the Clinton administration, she enabled the Russian economic collapse, and she was chief of staff to Strobe Taleb, and she helped design Washington's policy supporting Yeltsin's destructive shock therapy economics, which triggered mass poverty, hyperinflation, and the rise of oligarchs, which ultimately fueled intense public resentment that paved the way for Putin's rise to power. Then in the Bush administration, she was the architect of various Middle East interventions while working as Deputy National Security Advisor to Vice President Dick Cheney. When I look at her career, orchestrating the Maidan coup in Ukraine under the Obama administration as Assistant Secretary of State, she openly micromanaged the 2014 Ukrainian Euromaidan protests, something, by the way, which would be completely illegal under U.S. law, I believe 1972, a bill passed by Lloyd Bentsen, who was a former presidential candidate. She was very much the point person to orchestrating what many considered to be a coup. Could you talk a bit about the media handling of this, since obviously what they're calling Russia's aggression on Ukraine and Russia's war in Ukraine, whereas we know from 2022, there's barely a peep, unless like here in Italy, you read Il Manifesto, but even then, barely a peep about the facts I just stated regarding Nuland's orchestrating of a coup. less mentioned about what has gone on in the eastern part of Ukraine and what Russia deems to be a type of ethnic cleansing of ethnic Russians. What is your take on how the media has handled this, not just from 2014, but from 2022 and even now, where I'm getting more news updates? I kid you not. I'm sure you can relate because as a journalist, you can go to WhatsApp and get more facts than you can from mainstream media. So I'm getting daily feed from certain people sending me stuff or posting it on their Facebook wall about the many men daily kidnapped in Ukraine, forced conscription. Of course, they're not the upper 5%, are they?
Yeah, there's so incredibly much to say about this. And you touch on actually a lot of important points. One of them is, of course, the utter irony that a lot of the figures that present themselves as, anti-Russian, pro-Ukrainian, anti-Putin, this and that, for a long time, they completely supported Yeltsin, who was completely destroying the country. But not just, in terms of the shock therapy, the mass austerity programs, the privatizations, which completely destroyed the country. Like excess deaths are in the millions, the millions literally of people because of the fall of the Soviet Union and the way that was handled. But also very specifically, I very recently I was actually looking up some of the data on, for example, the bombing of Grozny in Chechnya. Under Yeltsin, which was completely supported. In fact, I remember Bill Clinton. Well, I don't remember. I was too young, but I read about it.
Well, I was having a bottle.
but basically, okay. So in the initial months of that bombing of Grozny, probably more children and a lot more children died than in the entire Ukraine war so far. Which has been going on for years on a much larger battlefield, right? So in just that one city, more children were killed by Russian bombs. And at the time, Clinton was defending this, literally comparing Yeltsin to Abraham Lincoln. I kid you not.
That's right.
Saying how he was keeping the country together, and so they were fully on board. As long as he was selling the country out to Western interests and oligarchs, it was totally fine. And of course, Putin was kind of. People sometimes forget this, but he was actually put into power by Yeltsin himself. He was the follow-up of Yeltsin. And at the start, also, when he started bombing Chechnya, everybody supported him. He got standing ovations in parliament. George Bush, as a president at the time, said he looked into his soul and, saw this. It was a great man who had, the best interests of his country in mind. And even to get it more to the recent case, just the utter and total double standards. In May 2024, so this is still under the Biden administration, I ran the numbers on the documented child killings in Gaza versus Ukraine, and the extermination rate of children in both territories was about 450 times worse in Gaza, 450 times worse in Gaza as it was in Ukraine. And still, nobody could speak about genocide in Palestine. In fact, they could barely even come out and support Palestine. They were still sending weapons to Israel, of course, and they still do to this day. So it's just a total and utter hypocrisy and double standards. And that this brings me back, of course, to what you mentioned, a lot of inconvenient facts. The Euromaidan revolt. To be fair, I do agree with your analysis that it was very much Western-backed regime change. But to be fair, there were, some mass protests also.
Of course.
But it was very... Yeah. It was very split, the support, and we saw this from so many polls, Ukrainian polls, mainstream scientific polls, that it was just very clearly split. The western side of the country supported it, the eastern side did not. And yes, the crucial kind of change, the crucial tipping point that made it into a successful regime change was not just, that a lot of people went into the streets, but it was, on the one hand, yes, all these backdeal maneuverings, of the various parties, along with American operators. And we know from some of the leaked audio calls that Nuland was literally handpicking the interim government, which then went straight into the bat with the IMF. Pushed through all the austerity policies. Slash minimum wages, all these kind of things. But also, and this is another very inconvenient fact that's rarely mentioned, is the deep role of the far right in all of this. Like somebody like Andrei Parubi, who was coordinating the Sotnias, or the kind of paramilitary structures that were set up during Maidan, who were openly threatening for a violent revolt. And that's what kind of, there was already a kind of deal with the opposition before Yanukovych fled, and basically that was thrown off the table because of the far right. And we know very clearly now, the whole sniper massacre, that kind of was the real tipping point, giving the kind of legitimacy for that kind of rhetoric. And that kind of revolt, that was a false flag operation. And there has been incredible amounts of research done by Ivan Kachanovsky, a Ukrainian scientist, on this, which various peer-reviewed journals, peer-reviewed books. This is something that's totally, utterly, completely blacked out. And what's interesting also, by the way, is what I noticed about this is that when I was writing about this is 2014 until like 2016, 17, I was intensively writing about this. And back then it was very hard to say these things. And I think that's partially because there was also quite a lot of attention for Ukraine. Of course, because at the beginning there was the civil war also going on. Crimea happened. There were the Minsk Accords. But then kind of Ukraine kind of dropped off the radar a little bit. And what's very interesting is that in those moments, a little bit more honesty seeps in. So there were a few articles, I think around 2018, 19, where suddenly there were more articles in mainstream newspapers talking about, fascism and neo-Nazi problems in Ukraine. And then you see it just completely going back to a full blackout in 2022. And that's, it's really obvious why, because all the world's attention was focused on it, and it would actually matter in those moments to say these things. So it's not like mainstream media cannot touch it at all, but you always see that they will start touching it only when it's kind of safe and it doesn't really influence policy anymore, and it feels like a distant past or something that's not really part of policy debates anymore, and things like that. So a lot to touch on there.
We just saw recently the demise of Ted Turner, and I've thought a lot about what CNN did since its birth in 1980 as this kind of model for 24/7 news. And everyone back then, I was raised between Canada and the US. So at that point, I was living in the US. I was a kid, and people were excited because we had ABC, NBC, CBS, and PBS, 4 channels suddenly, boom. Some people, of course, had cable. I don't really know the format it took, but it was very much a luxury item. And CNN represented this pioneering of news. And then if you think back to Gulf War I, I don't know if you remember that's when there was this experimentation with embedded news reporters, which was then repeated in Gulf War II, but to a greater degree and much more publicized degree. Sort of makes me laugh as a documentarian, because it was like they were trying to, now we're with the troops and we're giving you the unvarnished truth, when in fact it was the exact opposite. I'm sure you remember the scenes that we would be treated to. Of course, the news as it was reported during Iraq II was only the casualties on our side. Never, remember Tommy Franks, we don't do body counts. So we never had representations of people dying in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in the more covert wars that people like Obama engaged in Pakistan, and those drones, and those deaths from drones, I should say. So I'm thinking back to what you just said about Chomsky and Herman and their analysis of who is the product, which also in a way parallels to what's going on with social media and the way in which consumers themselves become the product. and the way that their biographical data. I'm fighting the fight here in Italy. Everything in the classroom here is Google, and I've been not signing forms. I said, can we use something else, like open source? Can we do something else? I'll teach you. I'll help your IT person if they don't know how to do it, if they even have an IT person. And it's a very big fight, because the status quo here and in many countries is that everyone will be better off hooking into Google, watching this online, doing that online. And it all fits together because the way in which we're taking in media is changing. And at the same time, it's being repurposed by, let's say, educational institutions and ministries. I was thinking about how this change even kicked off during lockdown. There was a huge experiment here where it was called Didattica alla distanza, which everyone had under a different name, but it was homeschooling. And everyone was expected to have their kid plugged into a computer. And I'm thinking, it's not the Jetsons, but the idea that we were sold in major media was everyone's good, everyone's going to do better. But in reality, studies have shown that education declined, learning declined. And this has everything to do with the way we intake media, because it's almost the same formula, as if looking at the embedded journalist in Iraq means we're getting more of the truth, not a setup, not a theater. So looking closely at your analysis of how the Western press manufactures threats even. Look at what's happened with the Strait of Hormuz, for instance, and the way that's been represented differently. If you look at Al Jazeera, the Chicago Times, Le Monde, even I go to Mexican papers as well to look at how this is being laid out for people and how these structures systematically substitute deep class-based and socioeconomic analysis for shallow cultural or religious reductionism. And I'm wondering if we could talk a bit about that, because I've noticed that a lot of what mainstream media is doing isn't bringing the conversation up a few notches. It's dumbing it down and simplifying things so that everyone can feel like I sarcastically said mullahs earlier, because that's what we don't want, the mullahs running the world, but they simplify it as if the Strait of Hormuz must be resolved or the mullahs will come here in Chicago and take over, right? Could you talk a bit about this kind of manufacturing of consent that is going on within Western media? Again, I'd argue it's been happening full on since lockdown. I mean, it was happening before, but it's going crazy full on since lockdown, and then Ukraine, and then obviously Gaza.
Yeah, again, there's so much to touch on what you said. I wanted to mention a few things. You mentioned the embedded reporters, and that reminded me. It's not just the embedded reporters. One thing I failed to mention before is, of course, also just the direct impact of intelligence agencies directly monitoring what we can and cannot view. We know, of course, of Operation Mockingbird, which during the Cold War, literally a lot of people were on the payroll of the CIA, journalists basically to push certain frames and certain perspectives. And actually, very recently, there was a reporting that apparently, even in the Netherlands, the Dutch intelligence services were very recently, and probably still are, paying journalists. They were literally on the payroll of the Dutch Secret Service, and I would be completely and totally and utterly surprised if that's not the case also in every major Western country. So there's also that much more direct meddling, although that's much harder to trace, of course. But you also see this, you mentioned the algorithms and the social media. Of course, we see shadow banning and the algorithms and how they push certain perspectives. There was, for example, in the Ukraine war, there was a early study. I think it was from the University of Maryland, if I remember correctly, which looked at bot activities in the discussion. And there was really a lot of it in the early weeks of the 2022 invasion. And they found that about 90%, if I remember correctly, somewhere around that figure, were pro-Ukrainian bots, or rather pro-NATO bots again. So you see, and that's also the irony, right? Because we constantly are reminded of, Russian disinformation operations and Russian bots and Russian this and Russian that. which I'm not saying it doesn't happen. Of course it happens, but the ironic thing is that they have a tiny fraction of the budget that actual Western intelligence agencies have for the same purposes. So it's just turning things completely on their heads. And in fact, in 2022, a lot of Russian media were just outright banned in Europe. And if other countries do the opposite thing, we immediately paint it as autocracy and all these kind of things. So there's so much to say about that. But I do like your analysis also of how they shift things away from systemic and class and political economy analysis to these very superficial kind of clash of civilizations perspectives. And we see this actually not just on the far right and not just like the kind of Republican wing. This is very deeply ingrained into the entire political center as well in the Western world. In fact, the leader of the Labour Party in the Netherlands, Social Democrat, literally in the early days of the genocide in Palestine in 2023, said on national television that you have to understand, these Palestinians, they have a culture of death. We have a culture of life. And that's why we need to support Israel. It's a complete projection, of course, in the middle of a genocide. But it's also very clearly kind of pushing away from for more systemic analysis, which could also actually help people develop a perspective of how maybe a lot of these resistance movements are on their side, how, all these budget cuts that we have in Europe, in the Netherlands right now, we see massive slashing in social security, in healthcare budgets. That we have a huge housing crisis going on. About, I think it was a quarter of housing now has mold and moisture issues. Waiting lists in the big cities for social housing is more than 10 years. The whole election promise of the centrist parties to, get into, which is why they won the elections, was like, we're going to build 10 new cities to solve the housing crisis. And then they got into power and they said, oh, no, that was a metaphor. You shouldn't take it literally. And then they end up literally investing nothing in social housing. Only 1 billion, but then from 2029 onwards, which means that probably the cabinet has fallen by that time and doesn't actually happen. And then tens of billions in weapons. And those are the same weapons that will then be used to bomb Yemen, that will be bought from the Israeli and American arms companies, which are exterminating Palestine. It's a kind of full circle. So if you would have these more systemic analysis, people, the working classes in Europe would also start realizing who the real enemy is. And that is very dangerous, of course. And that's actually, it's an interesting point that you make, because I mentioned how sometimes I could get some things into more mainstream media. And the interesting thing, this is something I noticed and that I always said, is it's always, it can be a decent story, but it will be always stripped of any systemic insights. So, for example, if you want to be a kind of, still a critical, good journalist, like maybe you can do like one of the investigative platforms that I worked a lot with. They did a lot of research, for example, into Shell. And, it's good to expose like corruption going on, or, maybe how they have deals with the government and these kind of things. But never in a more systemic framework. It always feels like, it's just one random corruption story and you can frame it any way you want, but not actually talking about, okay, why do we actually have corporations like Shell? Why do they have systemic power over our governments? How do these things come to be like this? And once you go more into that kind of systemic analysis, you just hold the door shut. And that's something I noticed very, very clearly. I think it's a very, very accurate point, an important point that you're making.
It's interesting because Herman and Chomsky also talk about weaponized ideology, hyper-partisanship, and we've seen a rise of that since 9/11. Before, as much as I disliked CNN, it was more objective than post 9/11. Post 9/11, as you just gave the example of they love death, we had that given to us 1,000,000 times over. I'll never forget George Bush when he declared the war on terror effectively, and evildoers, right? I thought, how old is he? This is how a 4-year-old talks, or a Baptist preacher. It was very interesting because in my own life and my own friends, they became pro-war in the Middle East. And I kept looking over my shoulders thinking, am I in hell? I just will never forget those moments of discussions with people very near and dear to me. And they just accepted it all because the propaganda was so thick. On that note, that's how I became pen pals with Noam Chomsky, because I was in Bologna on 9/11. I don't own a TV. So I ran to, paradoxically, my yoga studio, which was pretty much across the street, to see if they had a radio or a TV. Of course, they didn't. After I took in at my partner's family's house all the media, I became, for a millisecond, I don't know what to call it, but I was like, it worked. I became very worried about this Muslim infrastructure taking over the world. And I'm like, holy cow, what are you doing? I sat down, I wrote Noam Chomsky, and we've been pen pals ever since. I was talking to him about what happened to me because I've lived in the Middle East. I speak 2 dialects of Arabic. This was like, why did that happen to me? Even with Italian media, within 24 hours, all the bookstores here in Italy had sections on Islam with books that had nothing to do with 9/11, nothing to do with anything except Not Without My Daughter, right? That book that the feminists love to cite, even though the husband in the issue later wrote a rebuttal to the book demonstrating that that book was fraudulent. The whole story was Darvo, and that it was the woman who was abusive to the child, and he took the child over to Iran because the woman was quite a destructive parent. But that is what you saw in the bookstores here. What Iran has to do with 9/11, well, we don't know because we already know that Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11, but there we were, right? And it's very easy for educated people even, and maybe especially, to be convinced of these narratives that are pure propaganda. And when I saw this happening, and I saw my friends who were previously on the left, and I could only deem them as some kind of neoliberal phase of their existence, it was really hard for me to understand how they got on the side of going to what we were calling war, but it's not a war. This is terrorism. We enacted terrorism upon hundreds of thousands of Iraqis, depending on what system you use to do the body counts. There are body count calculators that have the death toll in Iraq and Afghanistan at way over 1 million, but we won't hear about those, will we?
Yeah, I think this is also one of the things that the manufacturing consent showed very clearly, and not just that book, but that same kind of methodology has been replicated by a lot of people. Also in the Netherlands, for example, by someone called Tabe Bergman, who wrote the Dutch media monopoly. But it's just every time some war happens and the West is involved, you'll see if there's a comparable war, like I gave you the example of Gaza and Ukraine, but of course, in the case of Herman, they talk about Cambodia and East Timor, but there's so many examples. You'll see basically the deaths at the hands of Western imperialism will be minimized, barely covered. The lowest possible death counts, lowest possible estimates will be cited, and the exact opposite happens the other way around. This is so consistent. This has been proven over and over again. So I think there's just no debate possible that this is what's going on. I think the only question is like, why does it happen the way it does? And then there are many factors that, many of them we discussed just now, like political economy, but also like ownership, of course. We also see more concentrated media ownership across the Western world. It's the same in the Netherlands, where a lot of the newspapers here are owned by basically 2 giant media corporations. So yeah, there's so many ways that we get boxed in, and yeah, I think you're totally right. It's very, very effective, but it's also becoming a little bit less effective. You mentioned this very at the start of our of the podcast. That even more and more people are starting to kind of distrust mainstream media, which I think is a great thing. It doesn't mean that they always get into the right in the good alternatives, because not all alternative media is great. But But nevertheless, it is very important that, like, for example, these Lego movies of Iran go viral, that people
Yeah.
are willing to actually listen to. I think we haven't really seen it like that since maybe the Vietnam War, where people were kind of siding openly with the Vietnamese resistance, even though they were living in the United States, in mass movements.
Exactly.
And I think for me, I think the important turning point for that was probably the genocide in Palestine. I mean, it was already going on before that, but I think on a more kind of mass level, I think it was just so obvious to so many people, especially because of how openly normally people try to spin it and hide it. And of course, the Western media tried to do that, but the Israelis just didn't care. They just openly proclaimed their genocide in a way that normally people try to hide it. It was even famously difficult to find like explicit orders from the Nazis for the Holocaust. This is often something clouded in secrecy and propaganda. And just within a few days, the Israeli defense minister was openly saying these are human beasts, and we don't want any food and any fuel and any medicine coming in. We will treat them this way. And I remember it was January 2024, after just a couple of months, the court case of South Africa, they had 12 pages of high-level genocidal statements all throughout the Israeli government. There was another organization that actually collected hundreds of similar statements throughout top Israeli media figures and government figures. So it was proclaimed so openly. There was so much footage. Everybody could see it every single day. And still people would just defend it like we were some freaking idiots, completely insulting our basic intelligence. This was already happening a little bit during the Ukraine war, of course, when, for example, with the bombing of Nord Stream, and they tried to blame Russia, which was just so utterly ridiculous. I remember my father, who's not a radical, and I always had a hard time kind of getting him convinced. And then for him, actually, that was a bit of a turning point, but maybe it helped that he read a lot about Ukraine because of my books. But then he was like, I mean, come on, like why would Russia bomb his own pipeline? But that was less emotional, right? It was a pipeline. It was not seeing children, women, men just ripped into pieces every single day. And I think viscerally that really changed something in a lot of people, which kind of brought the basis that we needed for people to really say, like, this is total and utter bullshit on a more mass level. Being able to seize on that, I think, will be a very important work that we need to do. Like in the Netherlands, for example, we've seen the return of mass protests that we haven't seen for decades, literally decades, like 250,000 people on the street right here in Amsterdam protesting against our government's complicity in the genocide in Palestine. And of course, there will be criticism. There were some opportunists there. They're not, all of them there wouldn't like full on with the Palestinian resistance or something like that. But it is, I think, an important change. And the Netherlands is a small country, just by the way. We have about 18 million inhabitants, like 250,000. We haven't seen that, like, basically since the Cold War, when people were protesting against nuclear weapons. That's like the last time we had any of that kind of mass. So that's really something. And it is our work now to make sure that, yes, we can complain that it isn't far enough. Yes, there was, the liberal soon-to-be prime minister who then betrayed all his promises, who was, taking selfies there. But it is interesting that there is a mass there that we need to seize upon, that we need to organize. And that is, I think there is actually a kind of return of fruitful soil for mass politics because of this genocide, but also because at the same time we see these mass austerity programs that are directly related to this genocide, buying these weapons. So you see the material interests of the working class in these countries now coming together with these more visceral disgust with these mass murders and genocides that really give opportunities for us to organize.
Yes, I completely agree. And I was thinking back to when you were talking about the reduction or the takeovers, basically, of corporate entities by even larger corporate entities within media. here are some numbers, because the journalist Ben Badikian wrote his book, it's a foundational book called The Media Monopoly in 1983, where he notes in the US that there are 50 independent corporate entities controlling over half the American media landscape. By the time Herman and Chomsky's book came out in 1988, the numbers went down to the pool of dominant companies shrunk from 29 firms in 1987 down to 20 by 1993. And then by 2011, there were just 6 major corporate giants: Comcast, Disney, Time Warner, 21st Century Fox, Viacom, and CBS. And then by 2018 to 2022, this is very tragic, but we've been running stories on this on Savage Minds. Over 600 local U.S. newspapers completely vanished, and the number of individual local owners dropped by 900, which caused a 25% drop in print circulation and laid off 36,000 working journalists. And going to today, where you have what is called the oligopoly in digital bottleneck, where 90% of households now rely on paid streaming apps, with the average consumer spending 6 hours a day consuming media controlled by the platforms we know of. Basically, social media has had a foot in this. And it is important to know, as you said earlier, it doesn't mean because people are going to TikTok that they're necessarily consuming correct information either. And this is a worry as well. I have days where I want to just have a UFO channel and just have, fake people calling, and I seen it. He landed in my backyard. I was grilling. Anyways, I haven't done it yet. I'm tempted to, because I'm sure you get sick. Yeah, I have genocide fatigue. I'm sick of it. I can't, some days, even just dealing, not just with people's writing and editing, but looking for photos for pieces. I'm like, oh God, no. I see some really horrible things, and I'd rather not. So I think the UFO channel might be a proper release. But the structural impact of what's gone on with these big 6 monopolies shifting into a tight digital oligopoly, where legacy media and tech oligarchs, like I'm thinking Google, Meta, Amazon, X, we're seeing fewer and fewer participants in having a say in what is happening locally, nationally, and internationally, because those voices are whose exactly. So when I have people saying on my Facebook page, I can't believe you posted that. I'll put something up from Candace Owens, and they get angry. Don't you know she's a right wing, blah, blah, blah. I watch her purely because of her takedown on media. It's brilliant. Plus her Brigitte doll. Who cannot love the Brigitte doll? But I think it's fascinating, even the pushback she faces, because she makes no pretense. She's constantly saying, this is what I think. I'm still digging into this subject or that. And I think it's very interesting, the people who are angry about people who dig into information. And I'm not likening her to Seymour Hersh, but isn't it fascinating that Seymour Hersh, who won a major journalistic prize for his work on a really embarrassing point of history for the United States, was suddenly disbelieved over the pipeline, yet he did all the work. Isn't it fascinating how they're a hero yesterday, but today, watch out for him,
Yeah, I think this is also the case with Eye of Stone, who's kind of considered a legend nowadays, but when he was actually alive, nobody gave a shit. And he had to publish some of his classics with Monthly Review Press, a small Marxist socialist publisher.
Yeah.
So this is very, very typical. We had something similar in the Netherlands, actually. I'm sorry, I forgot his name, but there was a journalist who was a bit close to the Indonesian resistance, Sinu Sukarno, and he was quite a critical journalist when the Netherlands was fighting their colonial war against Indonesia for recolonizing after World War II. And it turned out later that he was kind of blacklisted for decades by direct influence of the Dutch state, trying to get him out. And then and now suddenly when it's like decades later, we suddenly see all these kind of critical books being published about colonial history and war crimes of the Netherlands. But again, it's like when people feel safe about it, or when they think it's not dangerous anymore. And I think the Hersh story that you mentioned, it came out like right in the start of the invasion, where everybody, had to rally around the flag. They wanted to send as many weapons as possible. That story was just way too inconvenient to cover and to cover seriously. And this is also the thing that I think. And this is also, this is a general thing, but we see it even more clearly, I think, with Zionism and Israel. It's sometimes people think that if you ponder a little bit to, the mainstream or the Israel lobby, or, go halfway, give them a finger, that they'll accept you and that you'll get a bit more space to say something critical. But the interesting thing is, the moment you step out of line, they will come at you with full force. We see this also now, right, with the New York Times, who's been peddling all this pro-genocide propaganda for Israel for years. And then, after so much time, they finally published a story about the rape of Palestinians. And still, it doesn't matter. They get so much flack, they get so much attacked. It's like, don't expect these people to really, you give them a finger, they take your hand. And we see this over and over and over again. And I think it's an important lesson also to keep your back straight. Really not ponder to these forces and say it like it is. I forgot to mention, actually, and the takedowns, right, of TikTok and these kind of things. Actually, the content moderation and deciding who gets censored or not is also done a lot by intelligence agencies. Well, not exactly, but we see a revolving door. People who used to work for intelligence agencies who then start working for Facebook, Meta, so Instagram, also TikTok, etc., etc. So there's a very clear revolving door there as well. So it's very clear who gets pushed and who doesn't.
Yes, it goes that way for the agrochemical industry and who works within the government and pharmaceutical industry. We've seen this over and over. I believe Obama's appointee for the FDA also fits into that schema, but every administration is doing this. I'm seeing now in terms of how people are reacting to the news. I wrote on my Facebook wall yesterday, I forgot what story I posted with it, but I said, this is the dividing line in Western society. Now, we already knew. If you've ever stepped foot outside the West, it's self-evident. People do not agree with what the United States or even the West is doing, because let's not make this only about the United States. We have one of our writers who was arrested the first day. They made Palestine action a kind of persona non grata. That's still being meted out in the courts. But this individual potentially faces a prison sentence if this is not sorted out. So far, it's looking good for people who protest genocide. But what a state we are in, Chris, where up is down. And this is the way it's been represented. You have someone like, again, Candace Owens got a lot of blowback because she started speaking out, and ferociously so, against the genocide. And people were like, what? You are on our team. But this comes down to what I think is a societal cultural confirmation bias, where people believe that because they're a Republican, this has to be what you say. And because you're a Democrat, this is what you're supposed to say in the States. The same thing I'd argue with the Labour and the Tories. It's not happening. This kind of dynamic, this kind of duality or dichotomy, it's finished. Because I think what's happened since 7 October is that people are thinking, this isn't a left or right issue. This is are you on the side of genocide and ethno-supremacy, or are you not? And as I wrote on my wall yesterday, I had someone sarcastically write back saying, oh, as if everyone just thinks about Gaza and we have no other problems. And I wrote him and I said, of course, most people can't even pay their rent this month. They don't make it to the end of the month. They have to ration food. This is a reality for people who, before lockdown, were middle class. I know loads of people who have struggled, myself as well. And I think we're in this moment where we're seeing for the first time, I saw no photos of the Germans during the 1940s out on the streets protesting the genocide. Of course, there were underground groups doing that. And they were protesting, but they were acting underground, trying to form a resistance. At the same time, we didn't see this kind of blanket confirmation of genocide. We didn't. What we saw during the Second World War where sound bites got out into the news little by little. The idea of extermination was being leaked to the press. The press was showing it, but you didn't see people saying, that's not happening, or good, exterminate. But we're seeing a full-on cheering of a genocide, which should really worry everyone. I don't care who you vote for. That's a very worrying thing. And what's more worrying is, again, legacy media that is making what Iran did, let's say, and hitting targets where U.S. bases were as aggression, but the U.S. attacking Iran was self-defense. How does that work? It really is a mechanics of lying that I've never seen before.
Yeah, and I think you touch upon some important points because, like, for example, in the Netherlands, where I live, about 40% of the population voted for far-right parties. Only 20% voted for left-wing parties, and then I'm being very generous about how I define left-wing. The largest part of that was like the Labour Party, Social Democrats, who, as I said, was literally talking about a culture of death, right? So I think it's just a very self-defeating strategy. If you basically say that the majority of the population should be ignored because they had the wrong views on various things. That doesn't mean that, of course, solidarity organizing with refugees isn't important. It doesn't mean that a lot of these far-right parties are, basically also neoliberals, and once they get into power, they also often drop their support for anti-war movements. We saw this very clearly with Trump, of course, who claimed to be a peace candidate and became a war candidate. But I think we need to be also able to distinguish between, the hardcore ideologues, the hardcore parties, who, might be opportunistic here and there, and the broader following and the broader people who might vote for them and trying to reach them. Because I do think you're totally right, that there is a genuine disgust in a very, very large part of the population in all sectors of society, because it is a human thing. Like if you see kids being ripped to shreds, it does something to you. And also a lot of people, they come to their views, especially in the wider population, like the biggest newspaper in the Netherlands is the Telegraaf. That's literally the same newspaper who collaborated with the Nazis. They have the biggest, following. If people read that, yeah, of course, they get funny ideas about how society works. But it doesn't mean that we need to give up on, every single reader of the Telegraaf, because then you are literally, abandoning huge sectors of the population. So I completely agree with you there. That doesn't mean that sometimes we can be a little bit skeptical. I'll give you one example. Is like we have in the Netherlands Forum for Democratie. They're kind of like the neo-Nazi party, who was actually hardcore pro-Israel, like really, really hardcore. In fact, the main Israel lobby was deep into bed with them. They were speaking at their rallies and everything. And then a few years ago, they kind of strategically decided to switch and kind of pretended to somewhat be pro-Palestine, but then when they vote, you see they don't support arms embargoes and things like that. So, it is good to be skeptical here and there, but I think that should not be knee-jerk, and it should be in a way that we do think about how we actually reach the masses as well, because it is very self-defeating to just box ourselves up in a little corner, and ignore the fact that there are very good reasons that broad sectors of the population with very different views feel strongly about this.
Yes. In fact, on the other side of what Chomsky feared, he feared George Orwell's 1984. On the other side of that, we have Neil Postman, who feared Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, basically a society that's been inundated with trivial amusement, so much so that nobody cares to read books, which is sort of what we're seeing today. We have to I get writers, for instance, who say, it just happened on Friday, would you accept a piece? And it wasn't even that long. I'm like, of course, we welcome long reads. But I know, as does this writer, because that's why he asked, that people are not reading as they used to. During lockdown, there was a Norwegian newspaper that did an experiment, and they would not let people share an article unless they could answer questions like a reading comprehension test, which I rather liked, because we know that people are sharing articles having read the title and then boom, oh, I like what that says, boom. And a lot of people are reading only op-ed. How can you have an opinion if you haven't read factual-based journalism? I launched a subsection of Savage Minds called Disappearing Acts because the news is disappearing. And I think it's really important that we just get fact-based journalism. It doesn't matter if you like it or not. As I'll quote Ben Shapiro, the truth doesn't care about your feelings. And that's ironic because he's seeing his way out of the exit door on his very pro-Zionist stance, which is in a very odd way imploded upon him. Something I don't think he thought about. Postman's idea is that the medium is the metaphor. His theory is that during the print era, written text demands logic, but during the television era, it's a visual medium that demands fast-paced images, emotional stimulation, and simplicity. So Postman has argued that you cannot broadcast deep philosophical or political truths on television because the medium is inherently designed to entertain, not to inform. I'm referring to his infamous book, Entertaining Ourselves to Death. What are your thoughts about this dichotomy, especially given the rise of social media? Now, Postman is no longer with us. I wish he were, because I'd be interested if he would change his thesis somewhat, because we've seen how TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, even Facebook have changed hearts and minds of people because they've been watching a genocide on their mobile devices.
That's a great question. I would first start with emphasizing that I agree with the general analysis. Also, you know, it makes it extra hard. Like I think Chomsky said this once, that if you get very short segments that you need to defend in a debate on TV. If you just say what everybody already thinks and what's constantly said on all television and newspapers, you don't actually need to explain yourself. So it's very easy to say in 30 seconds why everything is the fault of Russia. But if you start saying something else, you actually need to convince people. And that's very, very hard to do in very short segments. So there's this kind of bias there as well. With social media, I have very mixed feelings about it because I do think for a large amount of people, it has opened up big opportunities, like you say, for alternative media to reach mass audiences. And this is really great. At the same time, I think we should also not fool ourselves in terms of how big we are yet. Like the majority of social media is not actually political content. It's also entertainment. It's also, you know, all these algorithms are also kind of dopamine addictions and keeping us locked into our screens in specific algorithms. And, you know, as we discussed before, there's especially anti-imperialist media get more censored and more suppressed. But that being said, I do, and I notice this myself also. I'm not actually very. I don't like being active on social media. I do it now because I kind of have to as a writer to get my work out. But I would, for example, be kind of passively following people on Twitter, and if you actually turn off the algorithm and only follow the people that you follow, right? So you don't get like the bullshit that the algorithm serves you, but the actual people you follow. It can be very useful because obviously people also, it can be a gateway as well to deeper reading. Like people can give you a link to their books, their articles, their essays. So I do agree with you that if it's used in the right way, can be quite useful, but I'm not entirely sure if we're analyzing on a collective and mass and macro level.
Oh, I agree. I was being glass half full for a moment. I am overwhelmingly hateful of social media. I use it as a billboard because if you don't have it out there, no one will click on your link, your site, your whatever you're working on. It's a necessary evil. And yeah, loads of people are not reading articles. They're retweeting or liking articles because the person that posted it, they like.
Yeah.
And this goes back to some very early 20th century sociological theories. It makes me worried about our future, however, because For instance, you've done a lot of work on neocolonialism and colonialism. When I mentioned the word on my Facebook wall, well, just that post I was telling you about, someone just posted to my comment about Gaza and this being the dividing line for the West in terms of basically a moral compass. What genocide? Feminist, of course, because the feminists have been saying that the Gazans don't need food, they need treadmills. I have serious problems with any group, any kind of micro-narrative group, to use a Leotardian term, like feminists, using this as a cudgel to advance their deep-seated Islamophobia, which serves them as what I call the victim feminists. They can then be perpetual victims because Islam oppresses us, because women can't name the thing that women can't do. Wait a sec, women can't do a hell of a lot of things here in Italy. If you have a child in Italy and you're a university scholar and you have to take off time because there is no place for your child, when you go back to the job market 5 years later, you cannot legally have a full-time tenure-track job in this country because they only consider the last 5 years of publications. I'm not making this up. I've been working on this as a side project and as part of my activism within this country because it's horrific. And of course that affects women, but the women's rights groups in Italy, if you go to their websites, it beggars belief. I laugh sometimes. It's all about the chador. It's the most extreme and racist stereotypes about a country or culture of which they know nothing. And I have serious problems with the way that neocolonialism is everywhere. It's like the Sixth Sense. I'm like the little kid that sees bodies everywhere and everyone else like, what? Yeah. No, there really are bodies everywhere. We have a neocolonial world. And if you don't know it, quit your day job, go move to any country in the global south, and you'll come back a few years later and you'll be agreeing with me because it's impossible not to. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and this is not just a problem of feminist movements in the West. It's a much broader problem. We see this also with some of the unions. It depends on the country, of course. Like I think Belgium and Italy are better in terms of international solidarity. But in the Netherlands, for example, the unions have been very, very bad on Palestine. And even within the anti-racist movement, there's sometimes a lack of international solidarity, kind of being more focused on like domestic issues than on actual imperialism. And decolonization becomes a buzzword, but then sometimes we forget that decolonization was actually about international colonialism and not just having a bit more color in boardrooms.
That's right.
So to be fair, this is, I think, a broader issue. With it can be with the workers' movement, it can be with women's movement, it can be within anti-racist movements. But there is sometimes a tendency that, especially within the global North, people want to navel gaze. People want to see themselves as the biggest victims, and people are also, protecting their own specific interests. And there's a long tradition of this, right? We have the social democracy basically as a tradition since the First World War, has been colonial, has supported almost every colonial venture and genocide since then, because their strategy was like, we don't need revolution, we don't need to disown the capitalists, we'll just kind of redistribute some of the profits and have a little bit better wages and social welfare. And it's the same for a lot of the early white feminist movements that basically wanted to be co-conspirators in colonialism and slavery. And I think, and the irony, of course, is that actually a lot of for example, the International Women's Day has socialist, communist roots. And you mentioned like Islam. In fact, like the first country with a kind of modern constitution that banned sexism was the Soviet Union. And that's also the place where then they had their early conferences against imperialism, inviting people from all over the continent, including all the main Muslim countries, and literally declaring jihad against imperialism. So it's like there is a long and good tradition of trying to combine these different movements, and really root them into political economy and anti-imperialist analysis. But that is also, I think, strategically kind of censored out of our history, and then we only kind of are stuck with these liberal groups who are fighting for their own little turf and their own little area, and are then happy to basically throw the majority of the population of the world under the bus. And it's easier, right? It's also easier that way to suck up to power. I think this was in France. There was a minister who threatened to cut off all the and don't quote me on the exact details. I don't remember the details, but there was a minister who wanted to cut off all the subsidies of feminist groups if they didn't support the mass rape hoax after the 7th of October, which is just, so even if you are a feminist group and you have the right position, you need some backbone to actually stick with that position, because you'll be attacked by power. And that is, that's what you see.
The rape hoax is something we've confronted myriad times with various journalists writing for Savage Minds. It's phenomenal how that has just come back over and over. And as you mentioned, the New York Times piece, which ran just over 2 weeks ago, was followed up immediately the next day by this quasi-apologia of, but Palestinians rape too type of piece. And I find this all very odd, because I can even talk beyond these moments of genocide. When I heard, I'll just skip to Russell Brand. It's the easiest thing to do here. When I hear about women who make rape claims 20 years later, I'm going to be honest. If they were women, not girls, obviously girls, they get the carte blanche because it takes years to understand when you've been raped as a child that you were even raped as a child. That's a completely different paradigm. But when grown women come out of the closet 20 years later, and it's being covered by a media outlet that just ran a similar story last week, by the way, they're making their name as we go after rape cases. To what degree are these manufactured stories? I've become very skeptical about all of it. On top of the believe all women mantra, I've had a feminist recently on the show who said, but no one really believes that. And I said, yeah, they do. I've been talking to them on Facebook and Twitter. A lot of them really do believe that there should be no due process. And if someone says this, that's the way it is because they have a vagina. So I become very skeptical about these groupings and these narratives, because as a leftist, I'm worried about the fact that we are not talking about the history of United States colonialism or British colonialism or French, or the immense powers of the IMF and the World Bank, and how they create never-ending generations of poverty for countries in the global south. We don't talk about that. Now everyone wants to talk about Trump, and it becomes personalized. They're not talking about structures. They're making this ad hominem. And I have to remind people, sometimes writers as well, I reject pieces. I said, I'm not running a piece that's about, I'm paraphrasing, but I've had pieces sent to me that are about the neo-Nazi Trump and the fascistic. I said, this kind of language doesn't really get us anywhere. Let's say tomorrow we find out he's a card-carrying fascist. Okay, then I'd run it. I'd rather we shy away from hyperbole and we get to actually what's going on, because when you start to look at the X-ray historically of the US, Trump is doing nothing differently than did Obama. Let's just be frank here. And people don't like to hear that. So this is why I think it's a lot of partisanship within the readership and the spectatorship of media. People want to hear about evil Trump on the, let's say, the faux left, the neoliberals. They don't want to hear about the very bad things Obama did. And I find that weird,
And that, and this comes back to the whole partisanship that you mentioned. Of course, there are some differences. That's not entirely the same, but the key point is that on the most fundamental issues, they are largely the same. Whether it is mass deportations, and then when it's under Obama, it's barely covered and nobody cares. When it happens under Trump, suddenly it's all around the news. And it doesn't mean that, of course, Trump took a few more extreme measures with ICE, but in terms of, if you look just at the raw numbers, millions were deported under Obama and Joe Biden. If you look at fossil fuels and climate change, Obama even bragged about how he made the United States the biggest in gas and specifically also fracking, which is like one of the most polluting forms of fossil fuels. If we look at imperialism and bombings, we know that it was Obama who massively expanded the drone programs, who searched the troops in Afghanistan. Of course, the whole fucking genocide in Palestine happened under Joe Biden. And in fact, Kamala Harris seemed to be willing to lose the elections simply to hold on to a policy of genocide. We know from some surveys that suggest that she probably would have won the election if she had taken a firm stance against Israel. So not just being pro-Israel, but being willing to lose an election, even though you yourself claim, and this is also the interesting part about what makes it so disingenuous, because they claim themselves constantly that Trump is fascist, Trump is this and that, and we can have an analysis, which I think is fine, about a certain level of rise of fascism. I don't think it's all bullshit, but it's just interesting to see that they don't really seem to believe it themselves. Because they don't actually go all in to try to prevent this. In fact, they're willing to continue a genocide and lose to this supposedly fascist who the apocalypse will happen and everything will get lost and it's all black and white and everything is worse if he wins and there's no way back, and then you don't actually do what you need to do to win that election. It's very, very interesting. And then I think when it comes to the whole the mass rape claim when it comes to Palestine, the interesting thing about this is it's not even a discussion about believe her, because they were barely able to even identify any victims. So we're not talking about
there were none.
So we're not talking about believe her. We're talking about believe the Israeli military. That's what we're talking about.
Right.
So and the claim is not just like, oh, maybe one or two people were raped. No, they're claiming a mass systemic policy, top-down policy of rape, which you would expect at least like a handful. Yeah. So it's just so utterly ridiculous. And then the other thing I think with the broader discussion you mentioned about this is I tend to be a bit skeptical. Like the discussion also in the Netherlands flared up a lot again about women's rights and sexual violence, and it is a huge problem. But one of the few things that people tend to not mention when it comes to sexual violence is that most of this happens in the household with people that other people know. Like if you want to do something about it, actually you need to start looking around your own neighborhood rather than at Palestinians or at Libya. Of course was also similar. There was a hoax about Gaddafi spreading Viagra pills to mass rape women, which turned out to be a complete hoax. Back in the days with the lynchings, of course, black men could be lynched for even looking the wrong way at a white woman. There's a really deep history actually about false claims of sexual violence against men of color to justify extreme violence, and I think this is not talked about enough. So right now in the Netherlands, there's this whole movement saying basically, all these people of color, and especially Muslim men and refugees, they're a threat to our women. While if we look at the hard data, the vast majority of people who commit sexual violence are white men, because they are the majority of the population, and their white women are most threatened by their own white men. But even there, it's interesting because it's even if you would take that analysis, then I think in some of the feminist movement also, then it becomes a kind of at least some of them catch this racism, but then it becomes about re-educating men. And I'm not saying this doesn't have any part. There is this kind of incel movement that clearly wants to kind of say no doesn't mean no and this kind of stuff. But what I find more interesting, for example, is look at the political economy, right? Like there's a very interesting book, Why Women Had Better Sex Under Socialism, by Gotze, Kirsten Gotze, and she looks at how, in fact, not just in terms of sexual violence, but just even like satisfaction in love life, being happy with your partner, all these things we know from a lot of surveys were a lot better in Eastern Europe than in Western Europe. Why? Because actually people had economic independence, because there was free healthcare, because there was free housing, because there was guaranteed jobs, because you were not economically dependent on your partner. So if you didn't even have to go that extreme in terms of, actual violence, just if your man wasn't interesting enough or you didn't love him anymore, you could leave. That's there's not that pressure to stay there. So I think also when we're talking about these things, the much more structural solutions are often kind of not talked about. So the way we talk about this, and this comes back to, I think, a kind of thread that we have throughout this conversation, is about how the dominant narratives in the media, but also a lot of the big NGOs or the politicians kind of take us away from a much more structural understanding of what is going on.
You're listening to Savage Minds. If you're enjoying the show, take a second to subscribe at savageminds.co. Feel free to comment below or drop us a line to share your thoughts. Support independent media today. Now, let's get back to it. This brings me to the question of what has united us. And again, since lockdown, I noticed a shift. I noticed it before around another issue that I was working on in the United Kingdom for many years. But that shift really came to full force during lockdown. And it was class hierarchies. Who was exposed economically during the COVID-19 lockdowns and who was not? I was not a plandemic kind of person, okay? I'm not saying this was all a plandemic at all, but I do think there was a political decision to use Italy as ground zero of lockdown because this is the country where 87% of Italians are homeowners, or they're children of homeowners. They pay no rent. So this was an easy win. You lock down people, who's going to suffer? A, the immigrant class that nobody cares about anyways here. B, the Southern Italians who moved to the North for jobs. No one cares about them as well either. What happened in these countries, and there's a long list of countries. Let me see, I've got the list here. Italy, Spain, Hungary, United Kingdom, Portugal, France, Austria, and Slovakia. They passed legislation of bank agreements allowing for borrowers to pause their monthly mortgage payments. Now, guess what happened to these same countries if you were a renter? Did they pause rents? Did they cancel rents? No, they did not. And this is what I was seeing during those first months of lockdown, well, from 20 February here, where, wait a sec, we're not making any money. I was doing a lot of commercial writing. It all stopped within 72 hours of our lockdown. And I talked to friends and the same thing happened to them. They were all in a stasis. But in Italy, where you have a huge percentage of adults being still subventioned by their parents, like a massive amount, it would never happen this way in the States. That cushion was there because within a week of being in lockdown here, all we heard about on the TV was when you could go to your second or third home and when football would start up again. I'm not joking. It just beggared belief. And I didn't know if to laugh or cry at that point because I thought we're in an extremely expensive flat that we wanted to buy a house and move out of in the next month. And now we're trapped. And the trap was complete. When you look back at class hierarchies exposed during the COVID-19 lockdowns, mortgages were frozen for property owners, but elite landlords were legally permitted to continue extracting rent from the vulnerable. How did that period permanently alter or accelerate class polarization in Europe? What have you noticed, not just in the Netherlands, but from also people you've spoken to in other European countries?
That's a great question, and there are so many levels to talk about this. I think one of the interesting things is also how Europe managed to combine the worst of both worlds in terms of COVID policy. And this goes back to our media framing as well. I remember very clearly when the pandemic started and China had a very harsh lockdown in Wuhan, where probably the pandemic started. We're not entirely 100% sure, but at least the first big recorded outbreak. And it was framed as this authoritarian, terrible, these savage Chinese Eastern country putting dictatorially everyone on lockdown. Yeah. I actually looked at the numbers 2 years later, and you know what? About I think it was 80% of the population, but something around I would have to double check with my previous articles, but about 80% of the population of China actually never went into lockdown, like didn't have a lockdown whatsoever, because they were very quick to lock it down in specific cities or villages or regions, so that most other people would not actually have to lock down at all. And even in Wuhan, it was about 2 months, if I remember correctly, which is literally often in various ways what we had in the Netherlands for the entire country. So this whole kind of, letting the disease rip. And of course, in terms of the deaths, it's not even comparable. Like we have tens of thousands of deaths in a small country like the Netherlands or Belgium, way more than China, which is 1.4 billion people. In fact, life expectancy in China was going up during the COVID pandemic, not down. And they wiped out extreme poverty in the middle of the pandemic. Like they managed it almost perfectly. And then to make things even more ironic, so we have longer lockdowns, more so less people children going to school, more people losing jobs, more people going into depressions, but also more people dying from COVID, more people dying from other infections, more people dying because they have waiting lists in the hospitals because they are overfilled and things like that. So they had literally the worst of both worlds. And the most ironic thing specifically about the Netherlands, sometimes, honestly, this country disgusts me a little bit. I'm talking about the ruling class and the government. But then the prime minister decided to call our lockdown an intelligent lockdown. It's not really clear why our lockdown was intelligent and others weren't. I mean, as I explained, we had literally the worst of both worlds. But then all the media, like clockwork, used this phrase in all of their reporting. If they were talking about the lockdown, they were not talking about a lockdown, they were talking about an intelligent lockdown, which even takes more words, it takes more space. And if you've worked as a reporter, that you need to always cut your words, but still they wanted to put this in, and it became so bad that some idiot reporter kind of internalized this arrogance and went to a press conference in Spain in the middle of like a terrible lockdown, terrible death rates. Like people were dying en masse in the hospitals. This was the height of the pandemic there and height of crisis there. And it goes into a press conference with all these Spanish people and journalists and the minister, and goes and asks, why don't you do an intelligent lockdown like we do in the Netherlands? It was so bad. But anyways, this is a bit of a long story to bring it to the point of the media framing. But I do think what you touch upon in terms of the class dynamics is, of course, also very big, because you see as well that a lot of the people who had to keep working were what they called the vital sectors of the economy, which were people realized were the actual people doing the work, like the nurses, like the firefighters, and people doing actual physical labor. And what's very interesting is that for a small moment, it seemed like, people thought like, oh, we might reappreciate them. And then straight after lockdown was over, they didn't get wage raises. They just got more budget cuts. Nothing actually changed. And you see the way the pharmaceuticals also dealt with this. Like I'm not at all in the kind of right-wing skepticism about vaccines, but I will say that the way it was dealt is just, again, basically collectively financed from our own pockets. The vaccines, but then the profits are private, right? And then even worse, the colonial aspect of this was also that they made sure that the global south didn't get the vaccines. And in fact, then when China and Russia started exporting vaccines, there were active sabotage kind of operations from Western embassies trying to put pressure on governments not to buy those vaccines. Like, what do you want? Do these people need to die? Of course, you had the whole issue about, which was the same with AIDS, right? About that you could actually, once the technology is there, you could mass produce generic vaccines so that people in the global south can get it much faster. And they were blocking that, of course, because they wanted to have huge profits. And this in the middle of a huge pandemic. So, there's the class dynamic within Europe, but there's also a huge class dynamic with the global South. And imperialism itself is a class dynamic, right? The wages tend to be extremely low there. The life expectancy and everything. We know that huge supply chains for Western corporations run through there. Just in the Netherlands, we know from studies that actually the majority of full-time workers in the Netherlands for Dutch supply chains don't actually work inside the Netherlands. There are more full-time workers out in the global South than there are Dutch full-time workers working for Dutch supply chains. So all of this is also a class story, right? And I do think the left was not able to tell this story well. I think what you saw is that a lot of the kind of anti-establishment atmosphere kind of went into, COVID is a hoax kind of thing. And I think we should have kind of shown that, countries like China, where actually most people didn't actually have to go in lockdown, life expectancy kept going up. We actually needed more investments in healthcare for hospital capacities. That kind of story we didn't tell. I think a lot of the especially the Social Democrats just went along to the government policy. Everybody felt like we cannot criticize anything, and I think that was a big mistake, and it gave a lot of space for other movements to go into. And it's the same. It's actually the same with militarization, right? There's a reason Trump could position himself as a peace candidate. It is because it's the same in Europe, right? Right now, all the Social Democrats are just completely going along with the 5% NATO norm, massive investments in the military. A few exceptions here and there, but that is the dominant course, and I think it's a huge mistake on a moral level, but also on a strategic level.
Yes, I see the same things you've just mentioned as well, because there's so much overlap. I remember people getting angry with me a month into lockdown when I started to post about, what I wrote a month ago about being careful about the virus. I don't know how much of this is even true, because the demographic, from what I'm seeing here in Italy, is the exact same as the winter flu. I don't see a reason why they're doing this. But you said a month ago, and I said, I have to remind people, I take in new information, I will change position. But then I started to follow what Tucker Carlson was doing on his show. And he was paying attention to class issues. He was looking at the truckers. He was looking at loads of people who could not afford food. Do you know what the left-wing outlets were doing by and large? And I mean, not only Jacobin's pushing of lockdown and other places I formally wrote for, that I said, I'm not doing this anymore. That's when I launched Savage Minds. I was getting pushback from leftist outlets because, I'm quoting one editor, we don't want to look like we're against lockdown. Oh my God. And then this is when it all fell together, that the right was pushing for things that not so many years before the left would have been doing. What's gone on? It's like, I don't know if you like that film, Strangers on a Train. It's that crisscross of I'll murder your person and you murder mine. But I was living on the Strangers on a Train reality. And I feel like I'm still there now, where we're seeing that resistance is happening across the political spectrum when it comes to genocide, when it comes to lockdown. There were far more on the right on that matter. The first guest to the podcast, in fact, was Noam Chomsky. And everything was going really good until we got to lockdown. And then he said what he said. And I'm like, oh, they always say, be careful of meeting your heroes. So it was shocking to me. It was really shocking to me to see even him advocate for fierce punishment for people who didn't take the vaccine. I'm really concerned about where we are in terms of solidarity, where I'm using examples here, like I could have used others than the feminists, but I'll go to AOC right now. These Democrats who claim to be socialist, and there's a zipper over their lips when it comes to genocide, when it comes to Iran, when it comes to so many things, they're useful idiots. At the same time, there is a global solidarity movement. How do we shift the narrative of migration from one of cosmopolitan benefit or domestic threat, as you mentioned, the EDI tick boxing that goes on, to one of fundamental human dignity and anti-imperialism? Because what's happening now is the right is still holding on to their DEI criticisms. At the same time, you have people on the left, they're reciting to a degree what Marx and Engels spoke about. how the ruling elite will weaponize immigrants to lower the wages of the masses, roughly speaking. What is your take on this narrative where it stands today? Because anyone who's been following what's gone on since Iraq II, Syria, people in Germany know this. I was living there. You saw Syrian refugees coming over. And of course, that feeds the ressentiment, the racism. Of course, I'm not saying that's right. But politicians are very aware that when you take on so many immigrants, that that's going to be a result. And it's almost as if the leftish ones are doing it on purpose so that they can use that as fodder for the next election cycle when they can say, well, these xenophobes, well, are they being xenophobic because they don't have a job that pays them enough to live, because the wages were pushed down, because of immigrants from all the countries we have either directly bombed or supported the bombing thereof?
Yeah, I think I might have a slightly different analysis on some of these. Sure. For example, if you say that the first term of Trump, he was a peaceful president, I think you're probably referring then at the...
Well, not a peaceful president. I'm saying he was the most peaceful.
Okay.
That first term had less war than all the presidents in my lifetime.
Well, we do put the bar
yeah?
somewhere in hell then, but
that's true. That's true. Definitely in hell.
But I will say though that, and I'm kind of a little bit proud of that as well, because I remember when my the English edition of my Ukraine book came out in 2017, and I just written a kind of extra chapter to reflect on the Trump presidency, and he had just been elected, and everybody was like, "Oh, he's gonna make peace with Trump. He's gonna do with Russia. He's gonna do this. He's gonna do that." And I looked very careful at his statement, and I was like, actually, he's saying that Europe needs to pay up and take over that front, and basically buy more weapons from the Americans. Like, this is what he's saying. Yes, he's saying, I'll abolish NATO if they don't, but that's not a peace position. That's in fact leveraging the kind of vassal status of Europe to militarize even further. And I think that is exactly what happened, in fact, in the first Trump term, in a slightly less extreme manner. And it's what's been happening in a much more extreme manner more recently.
Well, it was very direct last January when he came in and basically said, we're going to leave. But if you care to buy this supply catalog of weapons, then we'll consider staying in. That's what he did, forcing also a percentage of GNP to go to NATO, right?
Right. So anyways, I called that in 2017. And also it's good to notice that he actually sent lethal weapons to Ukraine where even Obama wouldn't. So I wouldn't say entirely that that Trump was that big of a difference, but fine. We can leave that there. What was the other part? Right. With the migration. I see your point, but I will nuance this a little bit. Like, I think, so there is definitely this aspect of using migrant labor as kind of cheap labor to push down wages. In fact, in the case of Europe, most of that is not actually from outside Europe. Most of them are from inside Europe. That being said, what is interesting, if you look at the actual targets that the politicians demonize, it's not actually the migrant labor. They're very much focused on the refugees, which are not actually that big in terms of numbers to actually push down wages and to actually change. Like they did the math. Like, if you wouldn't give any social housing to refugees, for example, the waiting list, which I told you is like 10 to 15 years in most big cities, it would only go down like a couple of months. And in fact, if you would give you could easily, if you would give precedence for social housing for homeless people, you could do that tomorrow. And again, the waiting list would only increase by a couple of months. So like, if we look at it a bit more deeply, we see that I don't actually think the big structural issues have anything to do with them, but they are very useful fodder for kind of playing this divide and rule politics. But I think on an objective level, actually, I don't think there is a huge issue. That being said, it is very Very ironic. The other thing is actually what I noticed is that the center will at the same time call the far right racist, but at the same time adopt many of their own policies. Like in the Netherlands, for example, and this is the same what we mentioned with Obama, right? In the mass deportations, but it's the same. It's the same here. Like almost every single party in the Netherlands, including the so-called Labour Party, is talking about a migratiesaldo, a migration saldo of like limiting the number of migration. And at the same time, they want to buy more weapons and bomb more countries. And then they are demonizing refugees while and not actually targeting the corporations that are benefiting from cheap labor. And also, the other ironic thing about this is if you would actually improve the rights of migrant labor and not push them into illegality constantly, actually people would be able to unionize and get better wages, and then that will also help Dutch workers get better wages, right? So I do think there's not necessarily a huge contradiction in terms of organizing in solidarity with migrant labor and refugees and local labor, but I do think the specific mechanisms of how that is dealt with by the so-called left in Europe is indeed full of hypocrisy and not addressing the actual issues. Yeah,
that was my point. I wasn't saying that there was no way of surpassing some of the damage that is being done by politicians, but I think politicians like to use, I will go back to AOC, they like to use the speaking points of how Trump handles immigration, while at the same time they do no differently. In fact, I have not seen many politicians at all, either here in Europe or in the US, address what's causing the migration. If you've ever moved country by economic need, it's a necessity. It's not a pleasant thing to do. People don't want to leave their friends and family. That's not a thing that people want to do. Yeah, maybe a year abroad in your studies, but in general, people are being forced to immigrate. Who would want to immigrate to the very country that made them refugees? And I talk to them all the time. I dealt with a community of refugees in Brooklyn who were in the United States precisely because the US had bombed their country. So I don't think people think it through, but yet the media latches on to this cliche, and it's a useful cliche, because we saw recently with the Maduro kidnapping how the WMD was rewashed. It wasn't WMD, it was drug boats of drugs that weren't even made in Venezuela, right? Fentanyl is not produced there, but let's just do that. And the American public that watches television at least bought it. But the American public, the younger demographics, did not. They were watching TikTok videos and they're like, this is bullshit. And the same thing with Iran. They tried to do the WMD. Wait a sec. Last summer, Trump said we got it all. Now it was like, oopsie, we left our opera gloves on the seat. We've got to go get those. No. And people were seeing through it, which is why Iran was so successful with their Lego videos, because they fed into the American psyche in many respects. This great land, they took down a few notches. And as it stands, the very man who wants to make a deal, and he tried to with the EU, von der Leyen and Callas, they're trying to push Europe into a war that people on the street here in Italy and in France, they want nothing to do with. There's a disconnect between what people have voted for and what the people in office are doing. Not that, let's forget that von der Leyen was never voted into any office.
It's very true. And one last thing I want to mention about this is that, in fact, if we're talking about the whole migration policies, the deadliest border in the world is the European border. And it was not built by the far right. It was built by the center. It's, in fact, much more deadly than Trump's borders. And we're talking about tens of thousands killed. This was Merkel's project. It was Rutte's project. This was even, again, Labour Party. Some people, the ministers of the Labour Party, were very directly involved with some of the deals that were made there from the Netherlands. So yeah, I completely agree with you. And yes, of course, the whole war is triggering these migrations is something that is not talked about at all. And in fact, like, one interesting thing is that there is actually a very kind of stable level of migration throughout history in terms of, if you look at the world scale, like in total, it's about 3% of people in the world tend to migrate. But the interesting thing is what's really like the few really mass migration phenomena, if we look at it, were all stimulated by Europe. The biggest one is settler colonialism. Like, if you want to talk about actual mass migration, you need to talk about the British Isles in the 19th century and the early 20th century, where people, in the millions were going to exterminate colonized peoples. But then there's also another type of mass migration happening at the time. It's slavery, or later indentured servitude. We're also talking about tens of millions, and it's only when free migrant labor comes then it becomes a problem. It's just and then again we're talking about the other big region where most of the refugees come from. Yes, it's of course bombings, and that's even when constantly the media, for example, in the Netherlands, there's this thing about the bezorgde burger, which they say, the concerned citizen. They always talk about the concerned citizen, but who is concerned about migration, but they never actually wonder, like, why are these people coming here? What are they fleeing from? In fact, it's so ironic. We had a recent scandal with a politician who's literally an Israeli. He probably works for the Mossad. I kid you not. Like, he literally didn't come through the screening. He was going to be a minister in the Dutch cabinet. He didn't come through the screening of the secret services because he had too close ties to another secret service. We know from various reporting this is most probably Mossad. There's a lot to say about this man. But he was questioned recently about Palestinian refugees coming here. And he was literally saying that we should use extreme violence against these people at the same level that Israel is using there. And then the interviewer goes like, just to check if he heard it well, you're talking about shooting them. He's like, yeah, you're talking about doing the exact same thing that happened in Gaza to them. He's like, yeah, maximum violence. And then, there is a kind of then scandal. People go like, oh, how could he say this? How could he say that? But then, the actual journalist, who was a leftist, actually, it was alternative media, was like, well, guys, what he's saying is not actually that extreme. I mean, it is extreme, but, what's more extreme is all these respectable ministers sending weapons to commit genocide. Like, this is just words, and that is the kind of strange like psychosis that happens in the discourse. It's like the etiquette. It's like you're allowed to commit genocide. You just have to say that you're talking with behind the scenes with Netanyahu and putting some pressure or something. Or you talk respectably about a few Palestinian refugees, even though you actually also stop them at the border. And actually often people do drown at the borders and they do get killed at the borders, but you just don't say it, Right. And it's just so utterly ironic, yeah.
But then you have the recent scandal that happened near Utrecht in Zeist, I believe, where a pregnant woman was assaulted by the police. That video was shocking. What is the Dutch media doing in its representations in these last 48 hours?
I'll be honest, I haven't checked enough the last 48 hours, the media, to give you a good answer to that. But I did see some media, so this is not a comprehensive, this is just some impressions. I did see that the police instantly started releasing information about, how they try to, they are investigating. They used some measures to calm down the situation. And just to be clear, like what happened very specifically, and this is a Palestinian man just heard that family of his was killed. Out of anger, he broke the television, but he didn't hit anyone or anything. But just because of the noise, I guess, people called the police. The police came. His wife actually was like, don't touch him, stay off of him. And then out of the blue, they throw, and this is a pregnant woman, they throw her onto the ground in a very violent manner. Luckily, she didn't miscarriage. She did give birth earlier than expected, but luckily, the kid didn't die. The baby didn't die, but it was very clear from the way they handled it that might as well could have. And then and you see just so clearly, then the obviously her husband gets aggressive after the fact, but before that happened, nothing happened whatsoever. It was just out of the blue violence. It's clearly visible on screen. So then they tried to frame it, and then of course the media, as far as I have seen, so again it's not comprehensive, but as far as I've seen, then just copy paste that. It's like the police said, and it's like, you can see the video. Why would you even, like, if you would have a video of this, of something happened to an Israeli, would you then lead with the statement of the Palestinian resistance? Of course you wouldn't. It's just ridiculous, the total double standard. And this actually a broader theme with the police is they're actually very good at this communication. Of course, it helps if the media constantly copy paste you, but they are very consistent of constantly framing it in a way that the police just has to deal with all these crazy people who are violent, and they have to calm down the situation. And then something that goes wrong, and then we will research it, but they always research it themselves. Nobody ever gets convicted. And they also they release, actually also every single year they release these data about supposed violence against the police. And then the vast majority of this, Radio Kopen does a quite good, small independent outlet does quite good research on this yearly. And they show that just the vast majority, according to their own data of what they push to the media, is not actually violence. It's like people saying like, "Oh, you're a dick" or something, like a belediging van ambtenaar in functie, as they call it, like insulting an officer. The vast majority is just that, or people not collaborating, so they have to get dragged. But a tiny bit of it is actual violence. And then if you compare it to their own violence, it's just completely incomparable. It's like not even close. But that's never sold. So they tend to, but the media tends to then copy paste that. Then there's this story about how police violence against police officers is going up. So yeah, this is a broader framing and dynamic. I am very curious, by the way, because I didn't check that specific dynamic about how some of the kind of racist sections are going to respond to this police violence, because it did happen at AZC. And it was, of course, a Palestinian man whose wife was assaulted, even though the wife was actually German. And if they're going to just accept this was police violence or just spin it again. But I didn't check enough to give you a comprehensive answer on that one.
No, well, I ask you about this because we had, not far from where I am, the incident that happened 2 weeks ago in Modena, where a man drove a car into people, Salim Al-Qudri. We ran a piece 10 days ago by Laura Cesaretti, wonderful piece on Italy's manufactured Islamic threat, because what happened here similarly posed this about this Maghreban, Moroccan, of Moroccan origin. He was born and raised in Italy, okay? But if you are of an Islamic background or an Arab or Middle Eastern background, it will be spun like that. I was immediately alarmed by the xenophobia. In fact, Laura's article looks at an angle that no one is discussing. Had this man not been Moroccan, which he's not, he had not been born in Bergamo, raised in Italy, but his parents were from Morocco, had that not been the case, and he had been Giuseppe, whatever last name, the story would have been this: a desperate 31-year-old Italian man who cannot get a job, who spent years studying and cannot get a job, was driven to mental ill health and desperation in this heinous act, okay? And this is what's going on in Italy. The derailing of any kind of deeper analysis about class and the horrific job conditions for young Italians. And young in Italy means under 90. No, I'm joking. But young in Italy, people are living with their parents until they get married. And even if they get married now, because of the economic situations for so many people, we're seeing this class divide. We spoke of it around lockdown, but there's a tangible malaise amongst the youth in Europe, not just Italy. European youth are facing a crisis of purpose characterized by soaring unemployment, a hyper-bureaucratized society, a total disconnect from political elites. How much of this generational fatigue is a direct symptom of late-stage capitalism's inability to provide a collective future?
Yeah, I think this is also a very good question. They used to say that the older you get, the more right wing you become. Like, I think the saying is, if you're young and you're not left, you don't have a heart. If you're older, you're not right wing, you don't have a brain or something. What's interesting is that that tends to be less true today. We see that, for example, as millennials are older, they're not getting more right wing, and I think that is has a clear reason, namely that it's actually a class issue. There used to be a time where a lot of people had stable jobs, would buy a home, would have more savings, the value of their houses might go up, and they start voting for the parties who protect those class interests. And we see that kind of collapsing. And I think there are various other mechanisms why the youth, of course, is radicalizing in many ways. One of them is, of course, the genocide, but the other one is the big one is climate breakdown. It's very obvious that the same forces that are exterminating Palestinians are not doing anything fundamentally to tackle climate breakdown. And again, this is the same kind of almost universal in terms of the Western political class complicity, in the sense that just like maybe the centrist parties would say a few words of how they do feel like it's terrible for Palestinians or how they do care about the climate, but if you look at the actual money they invest, about the actual policies they enact, barely anything is being done. Like I ran the numbers also for my next book, which is coming out with Monthly Review Press, and just most Western countries have barely had any reduction of CO2 emissions whatsoever. If you look at international supply chains and count the arms industry, and have actually a proper accounting rather than just blaming China for everything because the Western factories tend to sit there, or Vietnam or wherever. So you see them mostly subsidizing industries, at the same time sometimes enacting very unpopular policies. Like, for example, then they'll put like extra taxes on gasoline. But then that hits everyone in the same way. In fact, it doesn't actually hit everyone in the same way. It hits the poorest the hardest, because obviously, as a percentage of your income, if you need to drive to get to your work, it will be a much bigger deal if like the gasoline goes up €1 than if you're some millionaire or billionaire. In fact, if you're a billionaire, you probably don't even use a car. So it's just. It's the way that climate policies are used are basically class warfare. Like I was the list leader of a local party in Amsterdam, and the way I talked about climate policies would actually, because it has become so associated now with just these liberal elites who don't give a shit about working people, because actually a lot of their policies they do don't give a shit about working people, right? Like a lot of them are also subsidies for maybe green energy on houses, and then it turns out that you do the research and it tends to favor the people who already own a house, who can already invest something, so it ends up again subsidizing richer people. While real climate policies that actually put some zoden aan de dijk, as we say in Dutch, that actually put some create a bit of a mass basis, not just in popular support, but actually changing things fundamentally at scale, so to say, would be collective solutions like free public transport, improving public transport, like social proper insulated housing, like collective investments in green technology, in a nationalized fashion, in a planned fashion. We see this happening in China in ways that, they I think it was May 2025, they put down more green energy than the entire electric supply of Poland, right? Like these kind of things. Or another example you could use is Cuba as a leader in the world in terms of agroecology, right? Like we actually need these kind of collective investments. But then I tend to talk about them like, oh, do you actually want affordable, healthy food? Do you want to have affordable, stable energy? Do you want free public transport? Oh, by the way, we can do it this and this and this way. And these happen also to be excellent climate policies, but none in the center actually want to do it. And then, of course, because the way that someone like Macron or Rutte or Obama or Clinton enact climate policies, then these get associated with the kind of liberal elitism. And then you get the other side of the coin, where people just say it's all a hoax and we don't need to do anything and we need more fossil fuels. And we get this kind of, outbidding each other, the one wanting to make explicit what the other one does implicitly, basically.
Yeah, well, this is the writing on the wall that I started to see back after 9/11 with many of my friends who I thought were leftists, but were really neoliberals in all senses of the word. This is a problem in terms of education through the media and policies that, as you mentioned, when people have to pay more for petrol, their political outlook shifts. And that's sad because I would love for people to be more thoughtful about others, not having to have been bombarded to understand that it sucks to be being bombed by Israel right now or to be genocided by Israel. The issue that I saw with that person who wrote, "What genocide?" We're back to bricks and mortar. People don't like the definitions being used. People don't like the words being used. And reality matters. Words are the only thing that we have to evoke reality. So I think we're in this corner where we have the tangible rise of mental illness, isolation, and despair amongst the young people. Not to mention, those same qualities can be applied to many people post-lockdown. Here in Italy and in France, they have laid out these bonuses for psychologists. I don't know if that has happened in the Netherlands as well. But the government here will not say why. It's like, quelle coincidence. We have some help for you psychologically. I don't know what happened around 2021, where we locked you up like rats in a cage, but hey, maybe you need this help. And no one is talking about lockdown. No one's talking about the fallout from that. Not to mention the tens of thousands of businesses. It's even more now because the fallout from lockdown is still happening. You're seeing the shuttering of local businesses here day by day. And no one's discussing that. No one's discussing even the ethos of having a Jeff Bezos who's a trillionaire, that's allowed, that's even ethical or legal. What should be the European collective response to this when we're seeing the leaders ignoring those of us on the streets? There's an atomization happening. It's troubling to me. You have the elite atomized. They don't want to see us or hear us. At the same time, there is a unified resistance that's happening little by little. Although I think it is going to be a struggle for most people to quit all the jobs they're working to get out on the streets or even have the money to get to the protest. What do you see happening? Because aside from being a journalist, you are also a grassroots organizer.
Yeah, there's a lot to say about that. I already mentioned it a little bit in my previous answer. I've been organizing in various organizations for 10, 15 years. And now I'm also active with a local party. I think like what's interesting, for example, is to look maybe across the border where we have one of the few explicitly Marxist, anti-imperialist parties in Western Europe that are quite successful. And I think, which is PvdA-PTB, the actual Labour Party, not the fake Labour Party. I think what they do very well is they stay strong to their deeper ideological analysis, but they communicate in different layers. They take into account what we've been talking about also, how certain words have started to mean different things to people because of how they're conditioned by various media, various politicians. So it's also being a bit tactically flexible in how you communicate and being able to communicate in a way that really everybody can follow and that really touches upon bread and butter issues. because that is where most people are at. And that if you reach them on bread and butter issues, and if you manage to actually show that you can organize with them, whether it's in the unions or with what they have there is doctors of the people providing free or cheap healthcare, that you gain people's trust, and then it's also easier to then start talking with them about Palestine and start talking with them about other things, and then maybe they join your organization, and then they can start reading these actual books that we were talking about that people stopped reading. But there is a process and there is a layer, and you cannot expect everybody that will get on your see your Instagram video to immediately have read Das Kapital or something like that. And at the same time, I think also, being willing though to take the more radical stances, to abandon the center and attack them, to say that the militarization is ridiculous, that it's coming out of people's pockets, to speak out instantly when the genocide happens and not waiting until the ministers start saying a few things. That very, very interesting also how that happened in the Netherlands. Like for about 1.5 years, not a single person said anything in terms of the ruling class and the main political parties. And it was really only after 2 polls came out that basically the majority of the population, in terms of those who actually have made up their minds, thought it was a genocide. And then it was so instantly, suddenly, like, okay, not instantly. Then a week later, I think 1 or 2 weeks later, the minister started voicing some critique on Israel, and suddenly the floodgates were open, and suddenly all these people claim to be the heroes, and still not supporting any concrete policies of like boycott and divestments, but at least pretending to be suddenly calling it a genocide and things like that. But the utter and disgusting opportunism is just so deep. But I think that's something we have to abandon completely. One of the other things I think are very important is that we have and I think this is a global issue, but especially in the Western world, we have become so NGOized, so fragmented, so stuck in our separate issues, and also a bit hesitant to take organization seriously. There's a lot of work on this. I also touch upon this in my next book, but I think we need to start being more disciplined, taking more, like if we build our parties, for example, that we make sure that people are trained, are schooled, that people do what they say they will do, that we make sure that our members are active in the unions, in the groups, that we create coherence that way in the movement, and are not just like one person doing something there, one person doing something there. So I'm sorry if this is a bit of a scattered response. There's so much levels to respond to this, but I hope that's part of the answer for you.
It's an excellent answer. In your critiques of terrorism studies as a self-sustaining academic industry, you note how it fuels anti-intellectualism and censorship. How should a genuinely radical academia dismantle the industry? Because I've been in academia long enough to have seen the birth of studies, some of which are really good, like Africana studies, let's say, or film studies. But terrorism studies became its own niche post 9/11 again. What do you suggest that could be done about the commodification of basically an ideology that is embraced academically as a de facto science, as if they're terrorists because that legitimizes our going there and getting them?
I'm not actually myself in academia, or not at the moment anyway, so I'll give you a slightly more general answer than only about academia. But I think obviously the resistance movements have always been called terrorists. In fact, I remember, which is funny, a year ago in the middle of the genocide, and when they were constantly talking about the terrorists of Hamas and this and that, I was in the Resistance Museum in Amsterdam about World War II, and the Nazis, of course, called the partisans terrorists. But I found even a pamphlet of the resistance movement itself, kind of being like, "Fuck it, okay, we'll be terrorists," and kind of adopting it as a kind of reappropriating it as a resistance label, which I found just a little hilarious, because obviously especially in the Netherlands, the resistance of World War II is always, hailed as heroes, even though they kind of censor out the largest part of the resistance, which were communists, because they're inconvenient. But that's another story. But yeah, of course, Nelson Mandela was on the U.S. terrorist list until 2008. So it's very consistently a means of criminalizing resistance, but also to shift the discourse in a way that it's kind of like shifting the Overton window, that people then become scared to even people can even go further. Like right now, Palestine Action becomes terrorists suddenly. They're not even armed resistance, right? They're just sabotaging arms factories, which are literally committing genocide. So I think terrorism law is very, very dangerous. It is criminalizing. It is something like a colonial boomerang that will come back to bite us and to haunt us rather sooner than later, just like fascism in a way was a colonial boomerang, as I showed in some of my other books. And I can go off on a whole tangent about that, but then we'll be a half an hour later, so I won't. But it's whatever, they first frame a Palestinian resistance, which has the right to resist under international law, to armed resistance, but it will sooner or later come back to haunt us as well. But I think it's also about criminalizing international solidarity, criminalizing effective international communication. We know, for example, when we had the soft launch of our party, the Vonk, in Amsterdam, we invited Mohammed Khatib, who's the European coordinator of Samidoun. He lives in Belgium. And he was basically being framed as a terrorist himself, even though it's just a Palestinian prisoner support. It's not even Palestinian. It's a prisoner support net. It's a support network for Palestinian prisoners. But they're not like your typical NGO. They don't just say like, oh, we'll just document the human rights abuses and leave it there. No, they say like, actually, Palestinian prisoners are leaders and political subjects in their own right, and we can learn from them. We also want to give them a stage. We also want to have contact with them. And I think that is why, they are criminalized even to a much harder degree. Mohammed Khatib never said anything illegal, but still he was banned also for entering the Netherlands. He had to talk through Zoom, even though even their own lawyers, by the way, of the cabinet in the Netherlands advised against it. It was completely illegal to ban him. There was no basis whatsoever. But this is, I think it's very, very important. And of course, the whole premise of terrorism itself is just a ridiculous concept. There's this great song by Loki called Terrorist. And I think he opens with a dictionary definition, which was something like, and I'm paraphrasing now, but using political violence as a means to bring people into submission through fear. And if you actually would use that definition, then obviously the Western world is the biggest purveyor of terrorism in the world. It's not even close. In fact, they do it very explicitly and on a much larger scale than anyone could even fathom or perpetrate. Like if you look at the shock and awe doctrine, which was openly proclaimed by the US military in the invasion of Iraq as their own doctrine, literally saying things like, we want to have the effect of the psychological effect of a hurricane or a nuclear bomb to push people into submission so that they'll be in a state of shock and we can push through all these reforms that we want in a way that would be very hard to change. So I think, terrorism is something that we need to scrap from the dictionaries, basically, or reframe entirely. And also very interesting, by the way, talking about colonial boomerangs, Israel was very big in the early conferences, in organizing the early conferences, in kind of popularizing or repopularizing the idea of terrorism from the 70s onwards, or the 70s or 80s. So yeah, again, very important to challenge this framing.
The outgrowth of terrorism and the way that Israel has been allowed to call anyone, and I would argue that Hezbollah and Hamas, Hezbollah is a grassroots organization, it is much more than a quote unquote terrorist organization. We're watching the leveling of southern Lebanon in the same way that Israel leveled Gaza. One must look back to history books, and I mean go back to Nkrumah, go back to all of the decolonization that happened. Look at what happened in Algeria and the French. I think we have a Western populace that have never been properly educated in the colonial history of their own countries. And I see this. I talk to my kids about what they learned daily. They are not taught about colonial enterprises. None. Zero. This is atrocious to me, because though that cliche, those who do not know history are bound to repeat it, is also just a cliche. I think that there is strength to be had in awakening a consciousness within the people as to how Europe has and still dominates, and the US and Canada and certain other countries, the world, the global south, is still under the thumb. So of course, there's a lot of resentment towards BRICS and that organization. And many people viewed Trump's attack on Iran as a symbolic attack on BRICS and the hegemony that he's perceiving coming his way, which would be his just desserts on the one hand. But the lack of irony, introspection by Trump since 3 January in kidnapping a sitting leader, now threats to arrest Raul Castro, is lost on him completely, given he has been indicted by popular opinion as to being a pedophile himself. And hence, Iran's clasping of the Epstein political class was brilliant, because they've homed in on the one thing that our politicians are not listening to, that Americans are frustrated and furious even about the illusion around the Epstein files. And Iran is doing more of the politicians' jobs than our own elected politicians are doing, ironically. So I see that the way in which the word terrorism is used to deflect other national interests or other national internal problems. What is the way around that, though, given the dramatic rise of socioeconomic polarization, this enormous and amorphous bureaucratic apparatus, and low birth rates across the West, where paradoxically, they need the immigrants to come, right? That's what's happened in countries like Italy, the lowest birth rate in all of Europe. Now, it's a kind of egg on the face moment for those on the right and the neoliberals who make these claims against immigration. This means that we can no longer mask our own societal and political decay behind the myth of Western modernity. It's a make or break moment, if you catch my drift.
Yeah, I think your analysis is correct. And I think one of the things that we saw in the 30s with the rise of fascism then, and the kind of more open embrace of violence, it had everything to do with the fact that capitalism was in crisis at the moment, and there were like big revolutionary movements that might overthrow the order. And I think quite often it's there's this mistaken analysis, especially within the mainstream, of how fascism was, against liberalism, which, to some extent is true, but it's more like they were going back to the root of liberalism in the sense of like the early liberal revolutions. And Gerald Horne has great work on this, and Domenico Lo Zurdo, among others, and I deal with it quite extensively in my own work as well. The rights that they talk about was the right of property. The parliaments, these were for the people who were going around the world, enslaving, massacring, disowning communal lands, harshly also, crucially also repressing their own populations internally. I mean, in Great Britain, after the so-called Glorious Revolution, we saw an explosion of death sentences, people from as early as 11 years old who could be hanged for, stealing a handkerchief. And what you see is that just with the rise of like Marxist movements, working class movements, women's movements, anti-colonial movements, more and more people were starting to claim these hypocritical rights of the so-called rights of man for themselves. And because of they were starting to become successful, like fascism was not necessarily against the liberal setup as it was meant to be. It was just that they felt it was becoming too weak to crush what they wanted to crush. And that's why you also see the liberals in the countries that where the revolutionary threat was greatest, whether it was Italy or Germany. You see them siding with the fascists. You see Mussolini was Churchill, who is often hailed as a kind of hero of World War II. He was a big fan of Mussolini, and he always said, like, if we ever have a similar revolutionary threat as you do in Italy, in Great Britain, I shall wish that we have the same great leader who can deal with the Leninist beast. Or I'm paraphrasing now, but this is the kind of rhetoric they were using. And I think today we are living in a similarly crisis moment. It's just that the crisis comes from a slightly different angle. Of course, the movements in Europe and the Western world are not actually as strong. But you do see, and this is why I think your point was very important, you do see the rise of the global South economically. Of course, number one in this is China. But also since the genocide in Palestine and the war in Ukraine, this has gone into a kind of acceleration mode where also countries like Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, or even like very contradictory, BRICS is quite contradictory, right? India is not a progressive or leftist country in any sense, but at least there's some sense of a forming bloc in the South that is economically rising. China is the biggest threat because they are also kind of breaking the technological monopoly, which is the most important for Western imperialism, and continuing their unequal exchange. I mentioned before how like these supply chains are a class issue. Jason Hickel has done a lot of great work with some of his colleagues on really quantifying the extreme extent of unequal trade that's fueling these corporate profits in the global north. The extreme amounts that would be enough to build out the like basic infrastructure for human rights, for housing, healthcare, etc., for about 6 to 6.5 billion people. Or even in a broader level, if we're talking about capitalism, they calculated that we only need about 30% of our productive capacity to give everybody a good life. And then we're talking not just the basic human rights, but even like modern technology, like laptops and access to the internet, phones. And only 30% of our productive capacity. Imagine 30%. Like this capitalist system is so utterly irrational. But this order is just it's getting increasingly threatened, and that's why you see them resorting to more extreme violence. And that's also how I see the genocide in Palestine. I see it as a kind of lynching. I see also the element of the spectacle, of the open kind of the live streamed aspect of it. I see it also as semi-deliberate, as having a sort of function to tell the global South. And this is also why I think Trump is very interesting right now in the way how open he proclaims his Don Roe doctrine and things like that, and wanting to exterminate Persian civilization and things like that. I think there is an element of sensing, just like fascism felt like the liberal order, even though it was completely hypocritical. It was too useful, the whole thing about international rights, then South Africa coming to the ICJ. It's like, okay, let's just drop the pretense. Let's just kill these people. And that is, I think, what we're seeing right now. And it's a bipartisan effort, right? It's more open under Trump, but the fundamental material thing of seeing a live stream genocide also happened under Joe Biden. There are certain material aspects of it that kind of push in a certain direction. That's why the figure Trump is much less interesting than the reason why he is sitting there. And that, I think, comes back to what we said, the need for a more systemic analysis of what is going on.